They called it the Last Crusade. And in a single violent instant on the plain at Varna, what might have been a turning point became a catastrophe. A young king rode forward amid cheering banners, smashed through an inner ring of defenders, and did not return. By nightfall, the crusading host had dissolved into panic, prisoners, and smoke. What looks like a moment of battlefield drama was better understood as the end result of a long sequence of political haste, fragile logistics, divided command, and Ottoman operational agility. In short, the Crusade walked into a trap. The story begins not with armor and lances, but with diplomacy. In 1439, the Council of Florence seemed to offer a lifeline to Constantinople. Western Christendom, urged by papal appeals and alarmed by Ottoman gains, promised aid. Those promises took political form over the following years, in a patchwork of treaties, pleas, and hurried commitments. Hungary felt particularly exposed. The fall of Serbian principalities and the erosion of local buffer states left the Danubian corridor vulnerable. Wallachia proved an unreliable partner. Transylvania and the remoter borderlands offered little reassurance. For Hungary, the danger was immediate. Push the Ottomans back across the Balkans, or face a steady, grinding pressure on the frontier. Into that vacuum stepped three figures whose decisions would shape the campaign. Cardinal Julian Cesarini, the Pope's envoy, arrived in the region carrying the authority of Rome and the rhetoric of a crusade. He pressed for swift, visible action, part pastoral zeal, part political pressure to show Western resolve. John Hunyadi, the veteran captain and the kingdom's most trusted commander, had fought Ottomans for decades and combined personal ambition with a reputation for bold maneuver. The third was King Władysław III, a young monarch seeking prestige and a legacy in an age when martial glory still sealed dynastic claims. Each had reasons to move. Each had reasons to hesitate.
Cesarini's presence mattered less for theology than for coalition building. His task was to convert papal pledges into troops, funds, and a credible plan. He negotiated with Venice for naval support, coaxed contingents from southern Polish regions, and tried to bind reluctant princes into a unified push south.
Venice, for its part, was willing to help block Ottoman sea routes, if doing so protected its own trade and ports. The maritime plan centered on denying the Ottomans an easy crossing and cutting off reinforcements. Hunyadi, meanwhile, argued for taking the fight into the field, relying on heavy cavalry and the mobility of his veteran forces to exploit Ottoman weaknesses. Cesarini favored caution, a defensive posture across the Danube, consolidation, and the hoped-for arrival of a maritime blockade to strangle Ottoman supply lines. If that debate sounds academic, the stakes were immediately practical. Naval plans hinged on weather, piloting, and cooperation among Mediterranean sailors who were not uniformly committed to a crusading cause. River crossings depended on barges and local pilots. Fortresses that might secure supply lines were few, and time was not on the Christian side. There was also the political clock. The Pope and several allied princes wanted a visible show of force before attention drifted elsewhere. The result was a compromise of urgency and caution that produced a campaign with split objectives and fragile coordination. If this is sounding like a recipe for trouble, it was. Before the Crusader banners reached the Varna plain, a string of operational setbacks had already set the conditions for disaster. The Allied fleet, promised to blockade Ottoman crossings and to support river movements, was buffeted by storms and logistical delays. Venice's squadrons struggled to maintain effective control of the Black Sea approaches. Some ships failed to rendezvous, and in many accounts the maritime cordon never achieved the continuity its planners had hoped for. At the same time, naval transport for troops and supplies proved inconsistent. Where the Christians expected to seal off reinforcements, they found gaps. What they did not anticipate was how quickly Murad II would respond. The Ottoman Sultan used available maritime resources, Genoese and other local vessels, to ferry troops from Anatolia to the European shore. Within days, rather than weeks, Murad had massed forces at Edirne and along the approaches to the Bulgarian coast. Ottoman commanders moved with a rhythm that outpaced the Allied coalition's planning meetings. The result was simple. Rather than face a partially contained Ottoman army, weakened by supply shortages, the Crusaders confronted a rejuvenated opponent at home terrain, with swift cavalry and disciplined infantry ready to exploit every misstep. By the time Christian banners crossed the Danube, the campaign had already been stretched. Some towns surrendered or were captured in the rear, but sieges of stronger fortifications failed to deliver quick results. Hunyadi's and Cesarini forces advanced into the plain toward Varna, with the clear strategic goal of pressuring Ottoman forces and, if possible, pushing toward Edirne or even Constantinople. They took positions on the plain, confident the maritime blockade and Allied plans would hold. Yet supply lines lengthened, and the army's composition reflected the coalition's mixed nature. Seasoned Hungarian heavy cavalry, Polish and Lithuanian light cavalry and knights, Wallachian horsemen whose allegiance was uneven, Italian contingents and mercenaries, and the papal banner led by Cesarini, meant as a moral and diplomatic emblem of unity. Pause here for a short note. If this kind of deep dive into medieval strategy and pitched battles interests you, subscribe and stick around for more. There's more to unpack about the commanders and the campaign that followed. The morning of battle presented a study in contrasts. Ottoman forces arrayed under Murad favored flexible wings built around Spahi cavalry, the feudal-like horsemen who excelled at flank attacks and feigned retreats, and a corps of disciplined Janissary infantry, the elite foot soldiers who could hold a steady line and deliver volleys of missile fire. On the Christian side, heavy lancers and knights formed the backbone. Lighter cavalry screened the flanks. Artillery, less decisive than later centuries' guns, was present but did not determine the field. Command arrangements mattered. Hunyadi and his captains managed battlefield tactics, while Cesarini's role was more political and moral, urging restraint and pointing to the bigger coalition plan. That split in authority would prove consequential. Initial clashes favored the Crusaders in parts. On the Christian right, coordinated charges and local momentum pushed Ottoman light cavalry into retreat. Wallachian squadrons, eager to prove their worth, struck hard and briefly unsettled Ottoman lines. Hunyadi's presence in the field mattered. He conducted aggressive maneuvers, attempting to envelop Ottoman wings and press the advantage. For a moment, and contemporary sources emphasize it was only a moment, defeat for Murad seemed possible. The Ottoman center held, but cracks appeared on both flanks. The Allied camp sensed opportunity. Then the turning point arrived, sudden and irreversible. King Władysław, young and bound to the chivalric expectation of personal valor, led a charge with his household guard directly toward the Ottoman center. Whether he acted out of impatience, a desire for decisive glory, or misreading the ebb and flow of the fight, the result was the same. The king and his immediate retinue broke through the first lines, cutting toward the Sultan's tent. But in close, brutal combat, the king fell. Some sources report the king was unhorsed and then struck down. Other accounts describe his head being taken and shown as a token to rally Ottoman ranks. A janissary named Chamza is recorded in some chronicles as the one who delivered the fatal blow. A detail that appears in multiple narratives, though, as with many battlefield stories, the exact truth cannot be established with iron certainty. Once Władysław's death became widely known on the field, Christian cohesion collapsed. The psychological effect was immediate. Centuries of chivalric expectations and command structures had conditioned troops to rally around monarchs. The king's visible fall shattered morale. Hunyadi himself, recognizing the rout, worked to extract what forces he could. Cavalry charges turned into chaotic retreats. Parties were cut off, and where retreat met local geography or Ottoman cavalry maneuvers, many were taken captive or killed. Contemporary estimates of the losses differ. Sources and historians offer a range of possible casualties and prisoners rather than precise counts. What is clear is that the campaign's near victory disintegrated into rout and capture within hours. The battlefield's small-scale horrors deserve a sober description without sensationalism. Many knights and soldiers were cut down while trying to regroup. Others were taken prisoner and later sold into slavery or ransomed. Hunyadi escaped, but not unscathed. He was captured months later in a separate action and had to be ransomed, a political and financial blow that changed Hungary's immediate leadership dynamics. The papal presence in Cesarini did not prevent catastrophic losses, and the political aftermath left Hungary exposed and leaderless in more ways than one. Władysław's death produced a dynastic crisis. Hunyadi would emerge as the principal defensive figure in the coming years, but the crown's authority had been undercut. To call Varna a trap is to emphasize how strategic miscalculations created conditions the Ottomans could exploit. The trap had several interlocking elements. First, the Allied command was divided. Military pragmatism and political urgency pulled in different directions. Second, naval support failed to cohere into a reliable blockade. Storms, timing, and partial commitment left gaps. Third, the Ottomans displayed operational flexibility. Rapid maritime transfers, concentration at Edirne, and decisive use of cavalry that neutralized the Christians' hope for a constrained, attritional campaign. Fourth, there was human unpredictability. The king's impulsive charge collapsed the fragile advantage that had briefly emerged. Those elements combined into an operational snare, a campaign planned in part for show and in part for strategy, but lacking the unified means to achieve either. The immediate consequences reshaped the region. Politically, Hungary scrambled to fill a void. Hunyadi returned as a central figure, later negotiating ransoms and consolidating power in the absence of firm royal leadership. The defeat at Varna strengthened Ottoman prestige and deters some Western effort. It underlined how secure the Ottomans had become in the Balkans and how risky any large-scale Christian expedition would be without reliable maritime and regional support. In the broader sweep of history, the setback at Varna did not alone cause the fall of Constantinople in 1453, but it was part of a sequence that eroded Byzantine hopes for a decisive Western relief. Ottoman momentum continued. Hunyadi's later defense of Belgrade in 1456 checked Ottoman expansion temporarily, showing how leadership and prepared fortifications could blunt the Sultan's edge. Yet the longer-term pattern of Ottoman ascendancy in the region continued until the catastrophic Hungarian defeat at Mohacs in 1526, which decisively altered Central European politics. Beyond the strategic lines, the human costs and political aftershocks deserve careful treatment. Many survivors returned home broken. Prisoners were ransomed or enslaved. Nobles who had invested reputation and treasure in the Crusade found both diminished. Venice's limited naval role and its cautious calculations revealed the limits of Italian maritime states' appetite for full-scale continental war. Wallachia and other local polities adjusted their stances, sometimes seeking accommodation with the Ottomans rather than risking the violent swings of crusading ambition. And across Europe, accounts of Varna fed into a narrative of diminishing Western capacity to project force into the Eastern Mediterranean when it mattered most. Assessing blame is tempting, but must be measured. Cesarini push for action reflected papal urgency and the political realities of the moment. He was not indifferent to military prudence, but his remit and the expectations placed upon him favored visible deeds. Hunyadi's boldness derived from decades of fighting Ottoman cavalry and a tactical worldview that prized decisive battlefield action. The young king's desire for glory was personal, but also normative for his time. Murad II's commanders were not merely reactive. They exploited weaknesses with speed and local knowledge. Taken together, the campaign's failure cannot be reduced to a single villain. It was a systemic failure. Diplomatic timing misaligned with military realities, coalition politics hamstrung unified strategy, maritime fragility undermined strategic assumptions, and the unpredictable act of a monarch turned a fragile advantage into disaster. Looking back from a distance, Varna reads like a cautionary tale about coalition warfare in the late Middle Ages. Armies comprising different political units need a single coherent plan and reliable logistic support. Maritime power was already critical in the 1440s. Without it, land campaigns were subject to the tides and whims of supply. Command unity is not merely a matter of pride, it is decisive in moments when personal action can tip a balance. And finally, tactical advantage can evaporate in an instant if the psychological scaffolding of an army, loyalty to a leader, expectations of chivalric behavior, collapses under shock. Historians debate whether Varna should be called the last crusade in any formal sense. That label is interpretative. What the title attempts to capture is a period when crusading rhetoric, papal engagement, and Western hopes converged in an attempt to check Ottoman expansion, and in which that attempt failed in a way that closed off the immediate possibility of a similarly organized and politically backed expedition. Varna was not the literal end of all crusading thought. Rhetoric and intermittent campaigns persisted. But as a concerted, papally endorsed, multinational push into the Balkans that aimed to change the regional balance, it was one of the last such efforts to resemble medieval crusading in both tone and political sponsorship. The plain at Varna remains a stark lesson. Military history often focuses on numbers and formations, but Varna's central truth is strategic. A chain of small misjudgments and structural flaws can convert a near win into catastrophe. A blockade that failed to hold, a fleet that could not consolidate, commanders whose objectives were out of sync, and a single impulsive charge by a king seeking martial renown. Together, they created a trap no single commander could have anticipated. The Ottomans did not need to lay a physical ambush. They exploited the strategic and political conditions the Crusaders provided. In the decades after Varna, Europe felt the consequences. Constantinople fell in 1453, a watershed moment that without question altered the map of power. Hunyadi's later defense at Belgrade in 1456 slowed Ottoman momentum and became a rallying point for resistance. The long shadow of Varna extended into the 16th century. The dynamics of leadership, coalition reliability, and the interplay of sea and land continued to shape campaigns, most dramatically at Mohacs in 1526. Varna did not end history, but it redirected it. The last image is not of a triumphant standard, but of a field littered with the practical tolls of strategic error. Banners abandoned, ransom negotiations, a kingdom searching for leadership, and a region where one decisive day accelerated a broader pattern of Ottoman advantage. To say the crusade at Varna walked into a trap is not to suggest a single ambush or conspiracy, but to describe a situation in which political haste, fragmented command, logistical failures, and one fatal act converged to snare a coalition that should have exercised more restraint or secured firmer means before committing to battle. Varna was less a sudden betrayal than the predictable consequence of misaligned power and urgent, uncompromising expectations. If this episode strikes you as more than a historical curiosity, if you want detailed reconstructions of other battles where coalition politics determined outcomes, leave a comment with which campaign you'd like to see next. Like the video if you found the analysis useful, and subscribe for more deep dives into medieval warfare and political strategy.